It started on a calm Saturday morning in early spring, the kind of day when the air feels fresh and the sun makes the streets look friendlier than they really are. The neighborhood looked quiet and well-kept, with the same manicured lawns, pastel houses, and perfect sidewalks that had attracted me to it in the first place. Owning a home here was supposed to be a dream. It was supposed to be safe, peaceful, predictable. What I didn't realize yet was that those perfect streets were watched over by something much less welcoming. An HOA that believed it ruled every square inch of our lives. I had parked my car in my own driveway the night before. Nothing unusual. Just a blue sedan sitting neatly between the edges of the concrete. When I stepped outside to grab the morning paper, I noticed something flapping under my windshield wiper. It wasn't an advertisement or a neighbor's note. It was printed on thick paper with the HOA logo at the top. The notice said I was in violation of community standards because I had parked outside of designated garage space. It came with a warning of a $100 fine if I failed to comply. I remember standing there, stunned, rereading the words as if they might rearrange into something sensible. This was my driveway attached to my house, and somehow I was being fined for using it. At first, I assumed it had to be a mistake. I imagined some overzealous HOA board member confusing my car with someone else's, or maybe just testing the new citation system. I decided not to panic. I went back inside, made coffee, and tucked the notice into a drawer. Surely this would sort itself out. But the following week, a second letter came in the mail. This one was far more official, stamped and signed by the HOA board president himself. The fine was no longer a warning. Now it was real, $100 due within 10 days. If unpaid, it would increase to $250 and potential legal action may ensue. My disbelief began to harden into irritation. Still, I thought the solution would be simple. I called the HOA office, explained the situation, and they'd laugh it off. But when I reached the number listed on the letter, the response I got wasn't friendly at all. The woman on the line sounded bored, almost annoyed that I'd questioned them. She told me the rules were clearly stated in the community guidelines, and that all homeowners are expected to comply. When I asked her to point out where in the rules it said I couldn't park in my own driveway, she deflected, promising to send over a copy. 2 days later, I received a packet of documents. They looked official, filled with legal jargon and bullet points about landscaping, trash bins, and exterior paint colors. But nowhere in those 20 pages did it explicitly say what they claimed. The closest thing I could find was a vague sentence about maintaining aesthetic harmony through proper vehicle storage. That was hardly a clear prohibition. The situation started to gnaw at me. It wasn't about $100 anymore. It was about principle. If they could fine me for something this ridiculous, what was next? Could they tell me when to water my lawn or what curtains I could hang in my windows? I began to wonder if this HOA was as legitimate as it pretended to be. Late one night, I sat at my kitchen table with a laptop and a growing sense of curiosity. I typed the HOA's name into a search engine. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just the same bland information you'd expect. Meeting schedules, annual reports, and a generic mission statement about preserving property values. But then I stumbled onto something odd. A county database of registered HOAs. Ours wasn't listed. That raised a red flag. Every legally recognized HOA is supposed to be registered with the county, complete with board records and bylaws. If ours wasn't there, what did that mean? Could it be that this group issuing fines wasn't officially authorized to do anything? The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I noticed something I hadn't paid much attention to before. A few houses had small stickers on their mailboxes. Subtle, almost hidden. Reading no HOA jurisdiction. That was strange. I'd never heard of anyone being able to opt out of an HOA, but clearly, some of my neighbors knew something I didn't. I stopped by the house at the end of the street, where an elderly man often sat on his porch reading. I didn't ask questions directly, but I made small talk and eventually mentioned the letter I'd received. He gave a knowing chuckle and told me, in a lowered voice, that this wasn't the first time the HOA had tried to bully someone. Apparently, a few years back they'd attempted to issue fines for lawn discoloration, only to have several homeowners challenge them in small claims court. The HOA lost because they couldn't prove they had any real legal standing. That night, I dug deeper. I pulled property records, read through county ordinances, and even looked up the names of the HOA board members. What I found was infuriating. The so-called HOA wasn't an officially incorporated association at all. It was just a group of neighbors who'd banded together, calling themselves a board, and sending out letters to scare people into paying. The president, according to public records, didn't even live full-time in the neighborhood. He rented his house out to someone else while pretending to enforce rules. The more I learned, the more determined I became. They hadn't just messed with me. They'd been doing this to others, counting on people being too busy or intimidated to fight back. But they'd picked the wrong person this time. I wasn't going to let them steal a dime from me or anyone else without a fight. By the end of that week, I had gathered enough evidence to make their lives very uncomfortable. But I wasn't ready to go public yet. I wanted to be absolutely certain, and I wanted to catch them red-handed. So I decided to pay very close attention to how they operated, even if that meant letting the fines pile up for a while. I parked in my driveway again that night, deliberately leaving my car in plain view. Sure enough, by morning, there was another letter tucked neatly under the wiper. This time, I smiled when I saw it. Every fake citation they issued was another nail in their coffin. But I knew I had to move carefully. These people were arrogant, but they weren't stupid. If they sensed I was onto them too soon, they might cover their tracks. I needed to gather more proof, maybe even talk to other neighbors who'd been fined. And most importantly, I needed to find out how deep this scam really went. As I tucked the new notice into a folder with the others, I realized this wasn't just about stopping one unfair fine. This was about exposing an entire fraud operating right in the middle of my own street. The real fight was just beginning. Over the next week, I moved carefully, choosing not to alert anyone to what I'd discovered. I treated every letter from the HOA like a breadcrumb, a clue leading me closer to understanding how their so-called authority worked. 3 more notices appeared, one tucked under my windshield, one taped to my front door, and one mailed directly to me, each carrying increasingly aggressive language about outstanding fines and enforcement measures. Instead of panicking, I cataloged everything. I photographed each letter, recorded the dates, and even noted the times they seemed to be delivered. I wanted a clear timeline to show just how persistent they were. The tone of the letters shifted from polite warnings to outright threats, with hints about referral to collections and lien placement. They were counting on fear to make me pay up, but they had no idea I was building a case against them. Meanwhile, I started approaching neighbors one by one, under the guise of casual conversation. I asked if anyone else had been fined recently. What I found shocked me. Several households had quietly paid off similar violations, assuming they had no choice. One neighbor told me he had been fined for leaving his trash cans visible for too long, while another said she was cited because her mailbox paint was too faded. None of these people had ever questioned whether the HOA actually had the legal power to punish them. They just wrote the checks and hoped to avoid trouble. The more stories I heard, the angrier I became. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a single overzealous board member. It was a full-blown operation, preying on the community's trust. They weren't protecting property values. They were exploiting fear. To confirm my suspicions, I visited the county clerk's office in person. I pored over public records, searching for any trace of incorporation documents, bylaws, or official registration. There was nothing. Our HOA didn't legally exist in any recognized capacity. The group had never filed the proper paperwork, never registered with the state, and never been authorized to levy fines. As far as the law was concerned, they were just private citizens pretending to run a government. Armed with this knowledge, I began mapping out who was involved. I tracked down the names of the so-called board members, listed on the letters as president, treasurer, and compliance officer, and cross-referenced them with property records. What I found made the situation even more suspicious. One member didn't even own a home in the neighborhood anymore. Another had a history of small claims lawsuits filed against them by past tenants. These weren't people concerned with community standards. They were opportunists, I knew I couldn't confront them yet. If I tipped them off too early, they'd either go silent or find a way to cover their tracks. Instead, I decided to bait them into showing just how far they'd go. I parked my car in the driveway every night, sometimes even at an angle just to make it obvious. I left a second vehicle parked temporarily on the curb to see if they'd try to cite me twice. Sure enough, another letter appeared, this one with a bold headline declaring, "Final notice before legal action." Rather than feeling intimidated, I felt a surge of determination. Every new threat was proof of their scam, and I intended to use it against them. I even considered installing a security camera to catch whoever was delivering these notices in the dead of night. If I could record their behavior on video, it would be even harder for them to deny later. As I gathered evidence, I also started thinking about how to take them down effectively. Exposing them wasn't just about clearing my own name, it was about protecting my neighbors, too. If I simply refused to pay, they might back off, but they'd continue harassing others. I needed a way to end this scheme entirely. That meant timing was everything. I needed them to make a mistake, something so blatant it would force the authorities to take notice. Late one evening, as I reviewed the growing pile of letters, I realized just how reckless they had become. They were threatening to put a lien on my property, even though they had no legal grounds to do so. That was fraud, plain and simple, and it crossed the line from empty intimidation to something criminal. The next morning, I contacted a local attorney, not to hire him yet, but to ask general questions about HOA law in our state. I learned that only properly incorporated associations, with recorded covenants in property deeds, can levy fines or liens. If an unregistered group tried to collect money, they could be sued for harassment, misrepresentation, and fraud. I left the call feeling confident. I had the law on my side. The board had no idea that I was already 2 steps ahead of them. They thought they could push me around like they had with everyone else, but they were about to learn that I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to dismantle their entire operation. To make sure I wasn't alone, I started rallying quiet support among my neighbors. I explained what I'd uncovered, showing them the county records proving the HOA wasn't legitimate. People who had been too afraid to speak up began to share their own stories. A small group of us started meeting informally, planning how to handle things if this ever reached court. But before taking legal action, I wanted to see how far the board would go. If they tried to escalate further, I'd have everything I needed to bury them. I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, I received an envelope marked certified mail. Inside was a letter claiming I owed over $500 in accumulated fines, and that the HOA would be filing a lien against the property within 14 days. This was exactly the smoking gun I'd been waiting for. Not only was their claim baseless, but sending such a letter through certified mail made it undeniable evidence of their fraud. I slipped the letter into my growing folder, now thick with documentation, and smiled to myself. They had just handed me the rope I needed to hang their entire scheme in broad daylight. But I couldn't celebrate yet. The next move had to be strategic, deliberate, and undeniable. If I was going to take them down, I had to make sure every detail was airtight. The pieces were falling into place, but the real confrontation was still ahead. By the time the certified letter arrived, I knew the board had gone too far. Threatening to place a lien on my home when they had no legal standing wasn't just petty harassment. It was fraud, plain and simple. But instead of confronting them immediately, I decided to let them keep digging their own hole. If they wanted to play dirty, I would let them, while I quietly gathered every tool I needed to take them down. The first step was to document everything with a precision they couldn't deny. I set up 2 motion-activated cameras, one facing my driveway, the other hidden near my front door. I wanted to catch whoever was delivering the notices, especially if they tried to sneak around at night. Within days, the footage started rolling in. I saw one of the board members, someone I recognized from neighborhood barbecues, creeping up my driveway at dawn to wedge a letter under my windshield. On another occasion, a different board member taped a notice directly onto my front door and looked around nervously before scurrying away. It was all on video, time-stamped and crystal clear. Meanwhile, I met with more neighbors. Word was spreading quickly. People were shocked to learn that the HOA had no legal authority. One homeowner admitted to paying nearly $800 over the past 2 years for violations that didn't exist. Another told me she'd been threatened with foreclosure if she didn't comply with their landscaping requirements. The more stories I heard, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a scam against me. It was a full-scale shakedown of the entire community. I compiled everything into a neat, organized binder. Copies of letters, photographs, video stills, county records proving their lack of legal status, and testimonies from neighbors willing to speak up. I even kept a log detailing every interaction I'd had with the so-called HOA, complete with dates and times. I wanted to make sure that when the moment came, their entire scheme would collapse under its own weight. But I didn't want to go to the authorities yet. If I made a formal complaint too soon, they might panic, destroy records, or try to disband quietly. I wanted them to expose themselves even more, preferably in front of witnesses. So I came up with a plan to provoke them into escalating their threats. I began openly ignoring their letters. Instead of responding, I stacked them on my desk in plain view. I parked both my cars outside, even invited friends over and had them park on the street. It didn't take long for the board to notice. The letters became more aggressive, and one afternoon I returned home to find a bright orange notice taped to my garage door claiming my delinquent account had been referred to collections. They had no legal power to do such a thing, but the language was meant to terrify anyone who didn't know better. That night, I walked the neighborhood again, this time asking people if they'd be willing to attend the next HOA meeting. Many were hesitant, but when I explained I had proof of fraud and intended to confront the board directly, several agreed. Quiet support began to form. In the days leading up to the meeting, I went one step further. I called the county housing office to confirm, on record, that our HOA had no authority to issue fines. The official on the other end was blunt. The group wasn't registered, no covenants were enforceable, and any attempt to collect money was illegal. I requested a written statement from their office, and when it arrived in the mail, I added it to my growing evidence binder. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse. I knew it would be my chance to confront them in front of as many neighbors as possible. In preparation, I printed extra copies of the most damning documents, just in case the board tried to deny anything. On the day of the meeting, I noticed something unusual. Another certified letter arrived, this one even more threatening than before. It claimed they would file a lien within 5 days and add legal fees to my balance. That was exactly the proof I needed. Sending fraudulent threats through certified mail was a serious offense, one that couldn't be brushed off as a misunderstanding. As I slipped the letter into my binder, I felt a calm resolve settle over me. Everything was ready. They thought they were tightening the screws on me, but in reality, they were walking straight into my trap. When Thursday came, I walked into the clubhouse to find the room packed. The board members sat at a long table up front, looking self-important and slightly irritated at the crowd. Behind them, residents filled every chair, whispering to one another, clearly aware something big was about to happen. I took a seat near the front, my binder resting on my lap. The meeting began with the usual scripted nonsense. Updates on landscaping, reminders about community standards, and vague warnings about non-compliance. Then, as expected, the board president announced they would be taking enforcement action against homeowners with outstanding fines. My name was mentioned first, as if they wanted to make an example of me. What they didn't realize was that I'd come prepared to make an example of them. But I stayed silent, waiting for the perfect moment. Let them speak, let them brag about their authority. The more they talked, the deeper they buried themselves. I could see some of the neighbors shifting uncomfortably, sensing that something wasn't right. I knew it was almost time to spring the trap. My evidence was airtight, the witnesses were present, and the board was overconfident enough to incriminate themselves in front of everyone. All I had to do was wait for the right opening to lay everything out. As the board droned on about their power to levy fines, I felt the weight of the binder in my lap like a loaded weapon. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about dismantling their entire scam in one decisive move. The showdown was about to begin. The clubhouse buzzed with a nervous energy as the meeting dragged on. The board spoke in the same patronizing tone they always used, issuing reminders and threats cloaked as community updates. But this time, the residents weren't nodding along politely. There was a tension in the room, a shared unease that told me people were ready to hear the truth. I sat quietly in the front row, my binder resting across my knees. Every page was neatly organized. Certified letters, county records, video stills, and statements from neighbors who'd been pressured into paying bogus fines. I had everything I needed to dismantle the HOA's facade, but I knew timing was everything. The board president, a man who clearly enjoyed hearing himself speak, launched into a speech about enforcement measures. He listed off alleged violations in the neighborhood, pausing dramatically on my name, as though I were some kind of cautionary tale. He claimed I owed over $500 in fines and hinted that legal action was imminent. The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few people shot glances at me, curious to see how I would respond. I waited until the president announced they were moving to lien proceedings. His voice heavy with self-importance. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, not raising my voice, not making a scene, just calmly asking to address the room. The president tried to brush me off, insisting the meeting follow its agenda, but I didn't sit down. The residents shifted uncomfortably, sensing the confrontation building. I opened my binder, holding up the first certified letter I'd received, the one threatening a lien on my property. The room grew quiet. Then I produced the county housing office statement, clearly confirming our HOA was not legally registered and had no authority to levy fines or liens. Gasps rippled through the audience as I laid the document flat on the table for everyone to see. I moved methodically, page by page, showing proof of their illegal threats, the video footage of board members sneaking onto properties at dawn, and the testimonies from neighbors who'd paid thousands over the years under false pretenses. The more evidence I revealed, the more the crowd turned against the board. The president's confident expression faltered. He tried to cut me off, insisting that community covenants gave them power, but I countered with legal records proving those covenants had never been filed with the county. Without proper registration, their authority was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Residents began speaking up, emboldened by the evidence. People who had stayed quiet for years suddenly found their voices. One neighbor demanded to know where all the fine money had gone. Another asked if the board members had been pocketing the payments for themselves. The questions came fast, and the board had no answers. Their carefully constructed image of control began to crumble in real time. I kept my tone measured, refusing to let anger cloud the facts. I explained how every certified letter they'd sent was not only fraudulent but potentially criminal. I told the residents they had grounds to sue for harassment and recover the money they'd been coerced into paying. I could see the fear in the board members' eyes as they realized they were no longer in charge of the room. The president tried one last tactic, claiming I was misinterpreting the law. But I had anticipated that too. I pulled out a letter from the county attorney's office, explicitly stating that unregistered HOAs cannot issue fines or place liens. The room erupted in murmurs again, this time angrier than before. The residents weren't just suspicious anymore, they were furious. As the meeting descended into chaos, I stayed calm and clear. I told everyone that I was filing a formal complaint with the county and that any further attempts to collect money would be treated as fraud. I invited anyone who had been fined to join me in submitting their own complaints. The quiet support I'd built over the past few weeks suddenly became visible. Several neighbors stood up beside me, pledging their cooperation right there in front of everyone. The board tried to adjourn the meeting early, but it was too late. They had lost control. Residents crowded around me, asking questions, thanking me, offering their own stories of intimidation. The once feared board was cornered, silent and visibly shaken. Their scam had been exposed in the harsh light of public scrutiny. As I left the clubhouse that night, I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The board might still try to retaliate or save face. But their power was broken, and they knew it. The letters would stop now, or if they didn't, I had more than enough evidence to destroy them legally. When I got home, I added the meeting notes to my binder. The residents' reaction had confirmed everything I'd hoped for. The neighborhood was on my side now. Even if the board tried to spin the situation, they couldn't undo what everyone had seen with their own eyes. But I also knew I needed to move fast. If I didn't file the complaint quickly, the board might try to cover their tracks or disband quietly to avoid consequences. I wanted more than just silence from them, I wanted accountability. That night, I drafted formal complaints to both the county housing office and the state attorney general. I included copies of every fraudulent letter, the legal statements, and a summary of the evidence I'd presented at the meeting. I wasn't just going to stop their scam. I was going to make sure they faced real consequences for what they'd done. As I sealed the envelopes, I felt a sense of calm resolve. The hardest part, convincing the neighborhood, was over. Now it was time to finish the job. The board had spent years intimidating people with empty threats. But now the tables had turned. Their time was running out, and I planned to make sure they knew it. The HOA board had grown quiet after being confronted with legal documents. But it was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of scheming. For weeks, no new notices appeared in the mailbox. No mysterious violations showed up taped to the door. Yet the tension was unmistakable, like the charged stillness before a thunderstorm. Neighbors whispered about secret board meetings held late at night, meetings that seemed to end with heated arguments spilling out onto the sidewalk. Word spread quickly that the president of the HOA, a man known for his smug grin and iron grip on the community, had been scrambling to justify their actions. He had called emergency meetings with the treasurer and secretary, trying to rewrite records and patch up holes in their paperwork. They needed to make the fines appear legitimate, even if it meant fabricating documents. Meanwhile, the homeowner, who had started this journey simply wanting to park peacefully in his own driveway, realized he was no longer just defending himself. He was now unearthing a pattern of abuse that went far beyond his own property. Old neighbors stepped forward with stories of bogus fees, sudden maintenance assessments, and even threats of foreclosure for trivial infractions. Elderly residents had paid thousands out of fear, never questioning whether the HOA even had the legal power to collect a dime. Armed with this new information, the homeowner gathered evidence meticulously. He cataloged every notice he'd received, every envelope stamped with HOA letterhead, every email sent from their account. He requested copies of board meeting minutes and financial statements, knowing full well they were legally required to provide them. What came back was a jumbled mess. Missing pages, numbers that didn't add up, and signatures that looked suspiciously alike. But the board didn't sit idle. They attempted to strike back in subtle ways. Landscaping crews that once trimmed the common areas near his home mysteriously stopped showing up, letting weeds grow waist-high. Trash pickup accidentally skipped his house, forcing him to haul garbage to the main road himself. And late one night, someone left an anonymous note on his windshield, warning him to stop digging where he didn't belong. If they thought intimidation would work, they had gravely miscalculated. The homeowner doubled down, sending copies of his findings to a local reporter who specialized in HOA corruption stories. Within days, an investigative team started making calls around the neighborhood, asking questions the board wasn't prepared to answer. The board's carefully constructed image began to crack. Longtime members suddenly resigned without explanation. The treasurer claimed illness and disappeared from meetings entirely. The president, once so vocal, now avoided making public appearances, slipping in and out of his house at odd hours. The homeowner knew they were cornered, but he also knew desperate people made reckless moves. Sure enough, just when he thought they might finally back down, an official-looking letter arrived, this time threatening legal action against him for defamation and harassment. They accused him of spreading lies and damaging the reputation of the HOA, demanding he cease his malicious campaign immediately or face a lawsuit. It was a bold move, but also a foolish one. They had tipped their hand. The letter wasn't drafted by an attorney at all. The formatting was sloppy, and the language amateurish. A quick call to a law office confirmed what he suspected. The HOA hadn't retained legal counsel in years. They were bluffing, trying to scare him into silence. Rather than retreat, the homeowner prepared for the next step. If they wanted to play legal games, he was ready to involve actual lawyers. His research revealed something damning. The HOA had never properly registered as a legal entity with the state after its original incorporation had lapsed. This meant that for years, they had been operating without the authority to collect dues, enforce rules, or issue fines. Every dollar they had taken from residents had been collected under false pretenses. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the entire neighborhood. And as the local news team circled closer, the homeowner knew the board wouldn't go down quietly. What started as a simple driveway dispute was about to explode into a full-blown scandal. The question was no longer whether he would win. It was how far the board was willing to go to protect their crumbling power, and how much damage they would do to themselves in the process. The next chapter would not be a quiet one. The day of the special meeting finally arrived, and the neighborhood buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt in years. Word of the fraudulent fines had spread like wildfire after I shared my findings with neighbors. Many residents who had quietly paid questionable penalties over the years began digging through their own records, uncovering thousands of dollars siphoned off through bogus citations. By the time the meeting began, the once complacent community was furious, and they were no longer afraid to show it. The HOA board had underestimated the collective resolve of the people they governed. For years, they had wielded their authority like a weapon, counting on fear, confusion, and apathy to keep everyone in line. But now, every seat in the clubhouse was filled, with residents standing shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, waiting for answers. The president of the HOA, a sharp-tongued woman who had signed every threatening letter, including the one taped to my door, opened the meeting with an air of false confidence. One by one, neighbors spoke out. Some recounted paying hundreds of dollars in fines for trivial infractions, such as leaving their trash cans out for an extra hour, planting flowers that weren't approved, or, like me, parking in their own driveway. Others shared evidence of bullying tactics. Letters threatening liens on their homes, calls made late at night, and even intimidation during HOA patrols. The accusations piled higher and higher, and the board members squirmed visibly as the anger in the room grew hotter. When it was finally my turn, I didn't waste a single word. I presented everything I had uncovered: public records showing the HOA had failed to renew its charter, the absence of any legal authority to issue fines, and copies of the state statutes confirming that any financial penalties levied under these circumstances were invalid. My evidence was undeniable, and the crowd erupted in murmurs of shock and outrage. The HOA president tried to dismiss my findings, claiming it was all misunderstood paperwork. But that excuse fell apart when the state compliance office, whom I had contacted earlier, sent an official letter I now read aloud. The letter confirmed, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA had been operating outside its legal authority for over 3 years. Not only did this nullify every fine they had issued, but it also opened them to lawsuits and state investigation. By this point, the meeting was in chaos. Residents demanded immediate answers. Some shouted for the board to resign on the spot. Others called for refunds of every dollar taken under false pretenses. The board members huddled together, pale and shaken, clearly realizing the game was over. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. The president and 2 other board members abruptly resigned, leaving behind only a terse email claiming personal reasons. A state audit was launched into the HOA's financial records, uncovering misuse of funds that went far beyond the illegal fines. Lavish dinners, personal vacations disguised as board retreats, and unexplained withdrawals from the community account. Several former board members now faced criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Meanwhile, the neighborhood took matters into its own hands. A new interim board was elected, composed of honest, level-headed residents who vowed to restore transparency and rebuild trust. They immediately voided all outstanding fines, refunded money where possible, and initiated an independent audit to ensure every cent was accounted for. For the first time in years, neighbors felt they had a voice again, and the fear that had hung over the community like a cloud finally began to lift. As for me, I received formal apologies, not only from the interim board but from neighbors who had once assumed I was just another rule breaker causing trouble. My driveway remained exactly as it was, without a single violation notice ever again appearing on my door. More importantly, the scam was exposed, and those responsible would finally face justice. The experience left me with a lesson I would never forget. Bullies thrive in silence, and power without accountability always breeds corruption. By shining a light on their deception, I hadn't just cleared my own name. I had given the entire neighborhood its freedom back. Weeks later, as I watched the sun set over a now peaceful community, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The HOA that once tried to threaten me into submission was gone, replaced by one run by neighbors who cared more about the people than their power. The driveway where it all began had become a quiet symbol of resistance and resolve. What started as an unfair fine ended as a victory for everyone. And though the battle had been exhausting, it proved that standing up for what's right, even against those who seem untouchable, can change everything. 2.